Good morning, church. It is good to see everyone here today. I hope you've all been enjoying your sunnier, warmer weekend and that you've come to worship God today and be with your brothers and sisters in Christ. It is just a good day to be alive. So this is the third week of our monster series, checking in on the villains and the monsters that we see throughout the scriptures, kind of going in with the culture's vibes right now out in the world. And I've appreciated a lot of the positive feedback that's been shared, that people are enjoying these sermons, that they're fairly unique, and so they've been able to get something out of them. Just this isn't something we typically do, study the bad guys in the Bible. And so with that said, there's a lot of villains, there's a lot of monsters in the Bible that we could pick from. I was sitting there trying to prepare for a 5-week series, and I was like, man, I could do Cain, I could do Nebuchadnezzar, I could do Herod, I could do Goliath, I could do like a dozen different evil kings in Israel's history. There's so many options. There's even these like little obscure stories, like in 1 Samuel, there's a man named Nahash who just continues to sack and destroy all of Israel's cities, and he gouges out the right eye of everyone he takes over, right? These weird little stories. And so because there are so many different options for this, I'm going to do something that I don't normally do and open up the door for suggestions on next week's sermon, okay? I've got an idea, but I'm going to go ahead and solicit your advice and see what you would like to hear. I get advice sometimes, but this is one of the few times I'm asking for it, or at least on a sermon idea, okay? I'll take advice, but a sermon idea specifically. Like I said, I have one, but just remember, it can't be anything quite too scary, because next week there's no Kingdom Kids, and our kids will be here too. All right, so it can't be eyes gouging out or anything like that. But anyway, today I have for us a passage of a very legitimate monster. Okay, this isn't just an evil person who's choosing to do monstrous things like Judas, who we looked at last week, but this is a real monster. My kids love the movie Monsters, Inc., right? You remember this from almost 20 years ago now, Monsters, Inc.? What we're about to read is something that you might see walking in the background of those kind of movies, okay? And where else in Scripture would you go to find that kind of monster except for the book of Revelation, chapter 13. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns, and each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and his great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Like I said, this is a real monster, right? I mean, we're getting into some very beast-like descriptions. I mean, this is a horrifying image if you really put it out, and we will. Here's a visual of what was described there. There were scarier ones on Google, but I liked this one the best. Okay, it's the body of a leopard, the feet of a bear, mouth of a lion. There's 7 heads, 10 horns. Each horn has a crown. What it is lacking is that there's supposed to be a blasphemous name on each of the heads, And if that thing starts coming up out of the ocean on your next Florida vacation, there's a lot of people running for the hills, right? Okay, that's a monster. That's a beast. Now, I will say that almost nobody takes that description literally, okay? Which is a good thing, because it's not meant to be taken literally, okay? When John wrote this, he did not think that there was going to be a 7-headed leopard coming up out of the Gulf Coast or anything like that, okay? John is writing in a very vivid, figurative language here to describe the upcoming events in world history. And this isn't just unique to Revelation either. This was a very popular style of Jewish prophetic writing. Okay, we see it in the book of Daniel a lot. We see it in Ezekiel. We see it in Zechariah. We see it in Joel. We see it in other Jewish works that weren't even in the Bible. Okay, it's not anything new or crazy just for Revelation. We just kind of hone in on Revelation and none of the other things. It's just a very colorful way to write about the things that are to come. That really highlights the actions that will be had in the heavenly realm as well as the earthly realm. And that's an interesting and important concept when you read these kind of writings. It talks about the things that will come in heaven and on earth. That in the future, the things that happen are happening with earthly actions as well as spiritual actions, right? We don't think that Satan and God are void from any actions that are going to happen in the future, right? Whenever things are happening here on earth, there are things happening in the spiritual realm. And this vivid language is a way to kind of tie those two together. And that's what Revelation is giving us throughout this book. Okay, so it's not a literal monster, right? It's not a literal leopard, mouth, bear thing, okay? So what is it? What is it? Well, we know the dragon, right? In the very beginning, it talks about the dragon, giving it the authority. Now, the previous chapter, chapter 12, puts very clearly that the dragon is Satan, that the dragon is the devil. But who or what is the beast? Well, the popular interpretation these days is that the beast is the Antichrist, okay? And by Antichrist, what's usually understood here is this boogeyman-like figure who's going to be the spawn of Satan, who will rise up and cause the whole world to follow and worship him, leading us right into Armageddon or the Judgment Day or something like that, okay? You see this very popularly in the Left Behind book series. They've done a lot to really popularize this understanding and giving it a platform in the books and the movies and so much else. And with the prevalence of those works, it's probably safe to assume that there's more than one or two, even in our congregation today, who holds that view of Revelation, who understands Revelation to be talking about those kind of rapture-like events, that the beast is some kind of Eastern European politician that will be known as the Antichrist and so forth. But I'm sorry to say, I don't think that's what Revelation is trying to tell us, okay? I don't think that's what Revelation is trying to spell out. You see, the word Antichrist, which on my computer that was one line, okay? It's not supposed to, there's nothing dramatic about the two words, all right? And word Antichrist is not even in the book of Revelation. Do you know that? Neither is the word rapture, for that matter. You know, these left behind style beliefs are more or less a new interpretation. There's always been a few through history who've kind of used Revelation to code for the future or whatever, but really this popular idea really got its footing in the 50s and 60s. It's a pretty new understanding of the book of Revelation. Now, obviously, tradition is not everything, okay? But it's also not unimportant to consider how the church understood a passage for the first 1900 years, right? You know, that's a lot of generations of some really wise and really faithful Christians. And to disregard 1900 years of understanding of a book of the Bible would probably not be the best course of action. And look, I'm not trying to insult anybody's beliefs on Revelation. If you hold to those kind of premillennialist, Antichrist, rapture understandings of Revelation, I have a lot of friends and family who do as well. But I can only teach what I trust to be true, right? I can only teach what I trust to be true. And what I believe about Revelation is also what I think the church, or what history has taught us, that the church taught for hundreds of years. And that, at least for this chapter, is that the beast in chapter 13 was Rome. That the beast, and it sounds too simple, right? But the beast was Rome, or at least one of the Roman Empire emperors like Domitian or Nero, who really persecuted the Christians. But I think mostly we understand it to be the entire empire of Rome. I don't have this in my notes, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. So I told myself not to, but I'm going to do it anyway. So you remember the movie Shrek? Yeah, right. Okay, you remember the movie Shrek? Shrek is just filled with all these footnotes of little fairy tale stories, right? It's got the three blind mice. It's got Red Riding Hood. It's got Pinocchio. It's got the three bears. It's got all these fairy tale things, innuendos into the movie. If you had never heard a single one of those fairy tales and you sat down and watched the movie Shrek, you would have no idea what is going on, would you? It takes the knowledge of those other stories and those other backgrounds to understand what they're referring to and what they're applying in this other section. The same is true for Revelation, okay? We have to look back at Daniel. We have to look back at Ezekiel. We have to look back at these other apocalyptic, prophetic writings in the Old Testament to understand the metaphors and the images that they were using back then to see what it's saying in Revelation. Those are the keys to understanding Revelation. Revelation was written by these early people who had a Jewish background who had read those things their whole life. And they knew what they meant, and so they used them in this writing of Revelation, okay? Daniel 7 is a huge one, especially for this chapter, okay? In Daniel, he writes about these different empires who would rise up. It was the Grecian Empire, the Persians, Babylon, all these different empires. And he describes each and every one of them as, guess what? An empire. Or, excuse me, he described the empires as a beast. Okay, a beast with leopards, a beast that looks like a bear, and so on. And so what John is doing here is the exact same thing. He's describing this empire as a beast. You know, the beast had 7 heads, and Rome was the city on 7 hills. That's right, we still know that to this day. You know, the beast had 10 crowns, and Rome had 10 ruling provinces. The beast suffered a brutal wound, or a fatal wound, but was healed. Rome was this close to collapse in the years following the writing of Revelation, but miraculously salvaged itself to get back to even stronger powers than it had before. And we also know that from history, Rome truly did war against God's people. You see all the correlations. You see how perfectly this fits. Now, you might say, you know, I thought Revelation was supposed to talk about the future, things that were to come. Well, it does, just not for you, okay? It wasn't written to you, okay? To these early Christians in Western Asia and the Turkey area and stuff who he was writing to, this had not happened yet. This was to come. It was describing these upcoming persecutions and trials that they would face. And to that point, John writes in Revelation 1:1, okay, very beginning. We like to skip the beginning and get to the exciting stuff. But in chapter 1, verse 1, he says that these things are to happen. Do you remember this? Soon. I don't know of any reference point where 2,000 years is soon, okay? All right? I understand, but this is talking about things that happened back then. And really a large majority of the book of Revelation, so much of it is just about how the church should persevere and have faith in face of these dark times. How the church should relate to this evil beast who would be ruling over them in these horrible times. And that's what gets us to our lesson today. You know, I could spend all morning helping us understand how we should frame Revelation, how we should read Revelation, things about numerology and what the numbers might mean, what these images might mean. And I'm happy to do that some other time. But the lesson this morning is that there was a monster raging against the church, the children of God, 2,000 years ago. And more to that point, I'm not sure that beast ever really went away. You know, now as for this beast, Rome, it truly was a monster, okay? Our media likes to portray Rome as this virtuous, noble society, okay? And it was. For some. You know, if you were rich, if you lived in Rome, yeah, it was a virtuous, noble society for you. But for millions of people around the Mediterranean world, Rome was simply a boot, firmly pressed against their neck. And hey, if everyone has a boot on their neck, what do you got? Peace, right? And that's what they propagandized all over the Mediterranean world was, look what we, Rome, have done for you. We've made your lives so much better. We've brought peace to the world. You talked about every tribe and every culture. They thought this was every tribe and every culture just about in this time, right? And we have brought peace to the world. But it was peace through war and murder and enslavement and oppression and taxation and all these horrible, horrible ways. If you weren't a Roman citizen living in Rome who had money, you did not have a great view of Rome, right? Just read the New Testament and see how the Jews thought about Rome, right? How did they think about them in Israel? There was whole sects of people coming together to try to have violent rebellions against Rome because they had this deep-seated animosity towards them. You know, it was a violent and a cruel empire. It really was. They would just have fun coming up with new ways to torture people That's what gave us the cross, okay? The cross wasn't this age-old murder device that was around. No, they came up with, hey, how can we get people to slowly die and suffocate with the most amount of pain? Well, if we take these 2 pieces of wood and a couple nails, yeah, this is what they were known for. But even worse, for the people of God, Rome was adamantly idolatrous. Adamantly idolatrous. The Roman emperors throughout history proclaimed themselves to be gods in the flesh. You're probably fairly familiar with that. They proclaimed themselves to be gods in the flesh. They demanded that they would be referred to as deity. They demanded that they be called sons of God. Their coins, we even said, Julius Caesar, son of God, Augustus Caesar, son of God. And the people, they sacrificed to them as to the rest of the Roman gods. They demanded sacrifice. Now, if you're a pagan in that world, that doesn't mean too much to you, does it? You believe in hundreds of God. Why not throw Caesar up there as well, send him a sacrifice, make him happy, right? It wasn't a big deal to most of the world. But for the Christians, and also for the Jewish people, they declared that there was one true God. And the Christians declared that he had come to the earth in the person of Jesus Christ, and that he alone was worthy of worship, and he alone was worthy of praise and loyalty. Now, how do you think that sat with Rome? Exactly, yeah, not very well. We have a ton of old writings about how the Christians in those early days were tortured and killed because they refused to call Caesar Lord, because they refused to bow the knee to Caesar, because they refused to sacrifice to these Roman gods. There was even a time, I didn't write this down, I believe it was under Emperor Domitian, where it was a certain anniversary for certain gods, and everybody in the Roman Empire was demanded to have sacrificed to Caesar or to the Roman gods, and you got a certificate to show that you had done that. That's when they really started weeding out the Christians, because they refused to do it. They were burned alive on posts to help light the streets at night. They were thrown in colosseums to be torn apart by lions and tigers. They were crucified, or if you were lucky, maybe you'd just be beheaded if they didn't have enough time to do it in different ways. This is what they did to the Christians. This is what they did to the Christians' children as well, too. It was morbid. So you can understand why John and why the Holy Spirit would give John this vision to write a warning and an encouragement to the church to stay steady and to stay steadfast through that persecution. And they largely did. The stories we have of these Christians who stood up for Christ, even in the face of death, are miraculous. They're really moving stories. In fact, a preacher in the 100s AD, like mid-100s, wrote that the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church. That it was those Christians who died, who refused to bow the knee or call anyone else God other than the one true God, that itself was what helped the church boom in those early days. And when you read the book of Revelation through this lens, okay, through this lens of Christians facing intense persecution against the empire of Rome, not only does it just make more sense, because I believe it does, but it's so much more spiritually encouraging. Right? I mean, for me, it is so much more spiritually encouraging to hear these stories of how Christians were going to face an evil empire, how they were going to face persecution and stay faithful to God, than it encourages me to read a secret code for a future that I might not even live to see. Right? This is so much more spiritually encouraging to me. These lessons of faithfulness in dark times are so much more applicable. And that's why Revelation is still important. That's why it's still important. It's why it's still relevant to read about the beast. Because, hey, there have been many beasts over the last 2,000 years. Right? There have been many empires, many beasts throughout history, and each of them have set themselves up against the people of God. Now, for many years it was Rome, right? But Rome wasn't the last one either. So that's really the monster in our lesson today. It's not just Rome, although it is Rome. In a word, it's the principalities and powers of this world. The principalities and powers. And what I mean by this, and I added some notes after I already made my PowerPoint and sent it to the guys in the back. But what I mean by this is principalities and powers is the rebellious spiritual forces working against the will of God, who have asserted themselves through the very real systems and powers in our world through our history. Okay, I'll say that again because it's not up here. Principalities and powers are the rebellious spiritual forces working against the will of God, who have asserted themselves through the very real systems and powers in our world through history, okay? Does that make sense? Do you kind of see why it's important to see the heaven and hell and those spiritual forces and our very tangible earth oftentimes go hand in hand? Because this is exactly what's happening here. Just to give you what I think is a helpful example is Daniel 10. You might remember this story once I say, but in Daniel chapter 10, we see Daniel fervently praying for God's intervention, praying for God to do something. And he fasts, and he waits, and he prays, and nothing is happening. Eventually, he gets this vision of an angel. And do you remember what the angel says to him? Hey, God sent me to you right away, but I was held up by the prince of the Persian Empire. Okay? The spiritual force that was opposing God's will, that was trying to become an obstacle to God's messenger, to God's people, but was so associated with leading this empire of Persia, right? Now, and this might seem too abstract to be one of our quote-unquote monsters, but really, what's scarier than a system of power demanding worship? What's scarier than that? You know, I'm not some anarchist hippie from the 70s, okay? That's not who I am. But I can still recognize that human power systems can be genuine monsters in this world, can't they? You know, we can point to the oppressive regime of North Korea right now, or to the extreme the rule of Islamic extremists in the Middle East, both of which war against the people of God like Rome did so many years ago. And then we have ones that are a little different. You got China. In China, Christianity is not illegal, but any scriptures, any preachers, any worship services, they all have to get a thumbs up from the state. And the state likes to rearrange how that looks a little bit. And in fact, in China, the state-sanctioned church is not allowed to preach or teach the book of Revelation. You want to guess why? Because that's who they're talking about in the book of Revelation. These kind of things. You know, not specifically, it's not predicting China, or I don't think, it's not predicting China and all these things, but it's these kind of powers and principalities. You know, so when we can clearly see evil at work with these beasts and set themselves up against Christianity, it's obvious to us, right? But what about when these systems of power, what about when they try to co-opt Jesus? Huh? What about when the beast tries to dress himself up as the lamb? Because we see that. In the Eastern world, it's a lot of just direct opposition. In the Western world, we see a lot of beasts trying to dress up as the lamb. In the years leading up to World War II, with the rise of Hitler's power in Germany, the church in Germany largely, I don't know if you know this, they largely backed Hitler. The church in Germany largely supported him. He was viewed as a solid Christian candidate who was for family values and Christian values. And then he rose to power. And then without a separation of church and state in Germany, where the government and the church kind of work on the same platform, Hitler had direct access to spread his propaganda and to spread his influence through the church and hear it preached on Sunday mornings throughout Germany for years to come. Yeah? And that's what Nazi Germany did. Okay? It was a beast. None of us are going to disparage that, right? None of us are going to argue that Nazi Germany was clearly one of these beasts empowered by the dragon. And yet, it tried to align itself and look like the lamb. And you know, many Christians, they had the wool, if you will, pulled over their eyes because they idolized the beast so much that when they couldn't recognize when the beast was trying to sit in the throne of the lamb. They couldn't tell. They liked the beast so much that when the beast started trying to devour the church, they couldn't even identify it. Now, with that said, obviously many German Christians couldn't stand the blasphemy. They couldn't stand the idolatry, and so they left the country. These preachers, they resigned their ministries, and some even developed these underground churches that wouldn't be manipulated by the beast. And one of my favorite stories from this time period is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I referenced a quote from him on church just about 2 months ago or so, but I don't think I really told you his story, and it's a marvelous story. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Bible professor in the universities in Germany, and he was a minister at a church leading up to the 30s and 40s. And so when they rose to power, when the Nazis rose to power, all ministers who were part of the church had to provide an oath of allegiance to Hitler and to Nazi Germany. And he refused to do it. He refused to do it, and he was forced out of those positions. He wouldn't bow the knee to the beast, and so he was stripped of his influence. Or so they thought, right? But Bonhoeffer, he bravely set up a secret ministry training school to train ministers and to train future elders and ministers who were devoted to Christ alone, apart from the beast. That they would serve God and only Him. And he taught so many lessons for years and years and years, and preached in an underground church that there was only one king, the Lamb who was slain and who would conquer the beast. And they called themselves the Confessing Church because they knew and they confessed that there was only one king in this world, and it wasn't Hitler. Now, eventually, Bonhoeffer got found out, okay? Somebody told the authorities what was going on, and he was arrested for his rebellious actions. He was put in a concentration camp, and then later, on the direct command of Hitler himself, was hanged at the age of 38 or 39 years old. Now, Nazi Germany is always a really extreme example, and I don't like actually going there because it just seems like too much. And obviously, human kingdoms and some empires, some power systems, some are worse than others, right? Obviously, some are worse than others. But it has been my scriptural conviction for a long time now that no kingdom of man is fully compatible with the kingdom of God. That is a scriptural position. No kingdom of man is fully compatible with the kingdom of God. Kingdoms of man, they only exist by self-interest. They only exist by coercion. They only exist by consuming. And yet the kingdom of God is said to be made of self-sacrifice and freedom and love. They're just flat out not made of the same material. They're not even made of the same material. We are part of an alternative kingdom. We are part of an alternative politic that won't find its match until heaven is made full, right? Until Jesus returns. That is the only way we will ever find a kingdom that fits with the one we are a part of today. And that's because it will be that kingdom made perfect and made full. We serve King Jesus. In the world, they serve a different master. I mean, it's as simple as that. This is Ephesians 6, verses 10 through 12, right before the armor of God. He writes, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Throughout the Bible, language is used of principalities and powers in this world being under the realm of evil, right? Keith just read for us this morning how Satan claimed to have in his hand all the kingdoms of the world at his disposal. And Jesus never objects to that, does he? In fact, if it wasn't true, it wouldn't be very much of a temptation, would it? Jesus would say, "Oh, nice try, Satan," and move on. It wouldn't be a genuine temptation unless it wasn't true. Of course, God is still sovereign over the nations. We read about that in Romans 13 and other places. He still uses them to accomplish His purposes, but that doesn't mean that they're not under the influence of evil. Okay, look back at the Old Testament. We have Babylon. Babylon was a baddie, okay? They were very definitely under the realm of Satan. They were very definitely being used for evil. But even in their rebellion and even in their evil, God was still able to use them to His own advantage. God was still able to, in a sense, nudge and guide their evil free will choices to accomplish some of His divine purposes because He's God. And He can be sovereign even while things are evil and rebellious. I wish I had twice the amount of time this morning to go into these kind of things because it's hard. It takes a lot of groundwork for us to get into these deep truths, especially when they start maybe contradicting how we view the world, right? It takes a lot of groundwork to get to these places, and I wish we had more time to do that. But let me wrap up this morning by just trying to bring it home in this, what I think is an applicable way, okay? And that's to say that presidents are not our messiahs, okay? Politics and policies will not bring anyone salvation. There is no man-made nation that will ever bring heaven to earth. And the moment we start acting like they do, we might not admit it, but the moment we start acting like presidents can be our saviors, the moment we start acting like Supreme Court justices and politics and policies are the difference between heaven and hell on earth, the moment we start treating it like this, that's the moment we've begun bowing down to the beast. That's the moment we've started putting the beast in the throne of the Lamb. And I'm not saying we have to isolate ourselves from any national interest. I'm not saying you have to cut yourself off, move to an island where there's no government and go be an anarchist. Obviously not at all. But we should be at least aware or wary of unseen forces at work in this world. These unseen forces that are at work in all worldly powers, and all these worldly powers that have the potential to become a new beast, that have the potential to start demanding worship away from God, that have the potential to start waging war against God and His will and His people, right? This has been an extremely charged political environment the last couple of years, hasn't it? And depending on what side is in charge, it seems like people are either really ready to see the beast or awfully blind by it. You know what I mean? Depending on who's in what office or who's in control of what house, people are like, oh yeah, man, this is really that beast. This is really, the empire has gone bad. Or they're like, you know what, I don't actually see. This might be okay. This one's not so bad. It's really easy to pick one extreme or the other. But here's what we need to remember. We serve one king. We are the citizens of a different and better kingdom, and all our allegiance is due to them first and foremost. Republicans, Democrats, British queens, kings, or multiple prime ministers maybe at this point, Russian leaders, they're all just modern day Caesars, okay? There might be a Caesar that is better than another. There might be a Caesar that is more kind to the church than another. There might be a Caesar that does a couple things that are in the will of God, while another one goes completely the opposite direction. But they're all just Caesars. And like all those early Christians who were killed, who were ostracized, marginalized, and killed for their stance, we must also confess that Jesus is Lord and that He alone is Lord. If we can help you in any way this morning, whether that's by bringing you to the watery graves of baptism and into new life, or just the prayers of the church, we invite you to come forward and receive that now as we stand and as we sing.